there's a hell of a lot less to say about the second panel, so I'm just going to go through the notes that I made while watching it and pick up a few points for you that came out of it. So, according to the morning panel, they were supposed to use the afternoon panel to talk about online controversies more broadly and get deeper into Gamergate and how better to report upon it and things like it. Now, the whole afternoon session was bracketed by bomb threats. So at the first part, Koretsky mentioned that they had a bomb threat. Apparently, there were a total of 10 throughout the day, and then at the very end, there was a bomb threat as well, interrupting the discussion. Knocked about 20 minutes of useful time off the afternoon session. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but there's a lot of bullshit going around about this, and also very little reporting about it. Now, this is considered a credible threat, and it's the second credible threat that Gamergate has had in relation to it, whereas the anti-side that much media play has been made of out of Anita Sarkeesian's bomb threat was not deemed to be credible. The university, the police, the FBI all said that this was not a credible threat, and yet the talk was still pulled. Whereas this meeting has had multiple threats, including the final one, and tried to keep going. Indeed, people just went outside and carried on, and yet there's not the same level of news coverage. And the only reason I bothered to bring up the bomb threat, which is basically trying, is because of that disparity. It makes a fine example of the double standards that are going on in that reporting. Now, this one has been picked up a bit more. I think threatening to bomb a group of journalists gets journalists' attention, which is good, but still not as much as you might otherwise think. So, I mean, we all know it was an empty threat. We all know that all of them were empty threats. We all know it was always going to be spurious, but eventually something triggers the police enough that they have to act, because you can't afford to take that risk. So it's a cheap, shitty way of swatting a group of people, if you will. And this is the sort of thing that should stop. Now, who did it come from? My bet is third-party trolls. I think there's a slight possible secondary possibility. There's a bunch of conspiracy theorists, very invested, quite fritzy in the brain conspiracy theorists, who have basically been laughed out of Gamergate at this point. Now, I have a personal distressing experience in that the guy who shot up and threatened to blow up the Discovery Channel building was someone I knew on TribeNet, and was a conspiracy theorist who we often tried to kind of talk down and have reasonable discussions with, and sometimes we managed, sometimes we didn't, and then he turns up on the news doing that. And so, to me, people who are that invested in conspiracy theorists and believe that the world is that evil and wrong are a secondary possibility. But I don't think Gamergate would do that. It wouldn't be in our interest to do something like that collectively. And I don't actually think anti-Gamergate would resort to that level of stupidity. I can see a few of their hangers-on in the kind of radical feminist fringe and so on that might resort to that. But it would be unusual even for them. So I think we're just looking at third-party trolls, internet sociopaths. So I don't want to spend too much more time on that. I found the whole afternoon panel super frustrating. I've had a few arguments with other people about this, because I put most of the blame for it not going well on Koretsky, whereas others tend to blame Milo. And Milo was egotistical and cut in over people and grandstanded and all the rest of it, but I felt that the lack of progress was really down to Koretsky. And not to diss the guy too much, he put himself on the line, he organised all this, great, but his approach really prevented the afternoon session from getting anywhere. He wouldn't really let Summers, Milo or Kathy finish any of their points, draw any of the analogies that they needed to make, or refer properly to the history, or to other current events. What they were trying to do, I felt, was to explain Gamergate in the context of other things that have happened. So that's why UVA came up again, that's why Black Lives Matter came up again, that's why Occupy Wall Street came up again. These are things that regular beat reporters, regular sort of general reporters could understand and get a hook on. These are news stories that everyone's followed to a degree, so it's a kind of gateway into understanding Gamergate and understanding what the problems were. What were the problems with these issues, which are more conventional and unfold in a way that these reporters can understand, and from those mistakes, what can we learn and how can we apply them to Gamergate? But they were never allowed to finish these points, so it kept getting stuck trying to hit the same thing over and over again, and that was entirely due to Koretsky's interruptions. They were also never allowed to complete the connection between the militant social justice warrior rhetoric and ideology and the misreporting of Gamergate. They kept trying, and that's similarly that problem relates to these other news stories, but they were never allowed to make that connection, and so could never get that point across. And that, again, that's why it kept getting bogged down. Now, since then, Christina's taken some flack online from people for comparing Gamergate to Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. I think that's unfair, and I don't really understand why she's getting flack for it. She's not saying that video games are as important as people being unjustly killed, supposedly to do with their race, or it's not as important as the banking scandal or anything else. All she was trying to do was to draw a line of comparison between, these things are leaderless, disorganized, hard to understand, and yet they operate, and yet they accomplish things. Black Lives Matter much more so than Occupy. I think Occupy was the first example of this kind of hashtag activism actually accomplishing anything. But Gamergate's gone on longer and more effectively, arguably, than that, albeit with different goals. Black Lives Matter, similarly, you can draw comparisons there in that it's leaderless, it's based around a hashtag, but there are personalities like DeRay associated with it. The Splinter Group that has been harassing Bernie Sanders during his Democratic nomination campaign, they've been kind of disowned by the rest of the movement. We've seen even Gawker agreed that we can't taint the whole movement by the actions of a few within it, which was horribly ironic from Gamergate's point of view, because Gamergate's being tainted by the actions of a handful of people who have nothing to do with it, whereas these people are at least spouting the rhetoric and seeming to be part of it, just maybe on the extreme. And there's infighting there over that, but people are reporting it far more sensitively and far more responsibly. Because race, I don't know. But these are the points of comparison, and this is why it's valid, and this is why it's important. Now, Cathy Young brought up some valid points about the problems of the seduction of the harassment narrative, and so and how and why Gamergate became part of that harassment story, rather than what it was actually about, and the larger story of censorship and the loss of guts in reporting and academia when it comes to these subjects. She also made a very valid point, I felt, about the unwillingness of media, or indeed anybody these days, to question these victim narratives and to fact check, and that's where it tied back into UVA and so on. With regard to Gamergate, you've got people saying, "Oh, Gamergate harassed me," and nobody's bothering to check. Or even to think in some cases. I mean, recently a chapter of Felicia Day's autobiography was released, and she has a chapter on Gamergate. But you read through it, and most of it is just generally talking about harassment and trolling online, and then she suddenly seems to ascribe a bunch of that to Gamergate, which is unfair. And obviously a biography doesn't get filtered through an editor or something, but this is the sort of, did you fact check this? What's the evidence that this was linked to somebody else? These are the sort of things that should happen in reporting, and they weren't. Looking at UVA, it went through several editors. Nobody thought to, has this been fact checked? What's the evidence here? Is it responsible to throw out this accusation? And it isn't. I don't think it's ethical, and it's nowhere near as severe. But going back to Gamergate again, you got the same problem happening. People just buying into the narrative because they're lazy, or it fits their ideology, or they think it'll get more clicks, which means more revenue. you have to speculate here. Why would people compromise their ethical policies and their common sense in order to do this? So Milo got to say most of what he wanted to say, Christina got to say most of what he wanted to say, Kathy did okay, and then Koreski started interrupting, and it was just really frustrating to watch. I presume this is what they were trying to do, to draw these analogies and look to the past and say, this is what went wrong, how can we avoid that in the future, which is a perfectly sensible way to go about it. But even more so later on, Koreski was constantly going on about, oh, well, let's just forget about the past, what can we do moving forward? Well, he who doesn't learn from the past is doomed to repeat it. The best way to identify what went wrong and to figure out how to deal with it is to look at what went wrong in the past and what went wrong in these other similar situations. And these other similar situations are things that general reporters will know about and can relate to and can understand more easily than Gamergate. So if we look at the past problems in these situations that you do understand, and take the lessons we learn and transfer them across to Gamergate and other online movements and so on, then you have a basis upon which to proceed. But because Koreski kept screwing that up, which otherwise probably could have been dealt with in the first half hour, 45 minutes, that never happened. And the context was important too, and that kept getting cut off. Where does all this come from? Where does this social justice warrior behaviour come from? Where does this commitment to ideological narrative over reality come from? And he kept trying to get this across and kept getting cut off as well. So they never really got to get to make the point. And then Koreski turns to the other side of the panel after cutting them off constantly and asks, "Well, what have you got from that?" Well, obviously nothing, because nobody was able to finish really. The only point that had been made that was complete was talking about how stories get uncritically repeated, and that's definitely a lesson that needs to go forward. When you get a story from another source, view that as a lead rather than a cut and paste. I think that's something to go for. I really wish Milo had, despite his grandstanding and so on, had been left free to make his point, because financial corruption is much more obvious and easy to explain to people, but ideological corruption and cronyism of the kind that we've seen in relation to Gamergate is much harder to convey to people. Various tacks were tried, including Christina trying to talk about it via confirmation bias. Does this already agree with my opinion? Or are you going out to find things that agree with your existing opinion, your ideology, your stances, or are you going out to try and find the truth? And this is a much broader problem. This is the problem we're seeing in things like with Digro. They're not looking to find out what's true. They're investigating their own biases and, unsurprisingly, finding things to support them. This is the point I've been trying to get across to people when we've had the social justice versus ethics divide in Gamergate. They're not separate. You can't divide the ideological issues from the corruption and ethical issues, because they're intimately tied together. People working together on Game Journo Pros to prosecute a particular agenda. People were reporting favourably on their friends, not just because they're friends, but because they're ideological bedfellows. So you can't disentangle the two. Money is an obvious motivation that everyone can grasp. Oh, okay, right, this company is paying you a bunch of money for a good review, you gave them a good review, you get the money, or the shiny new Alienware laptop, or the prostitutes, or any of these other things that have come out as well during all this. Whereas ideologically, what do you get out of it? Well, I get to forward my agenda, maybe I get some blue-haired she-twinks. That's much harder to get across to people and requires that you understand the context. So it's hard to explain in a soundbite, I guess is what we're saying. Sorry, my voice is going a bit from doing the other video. So Koreski asked, how do you source things? How do you get to the bottom of things? How do you understand Gamergate? How do you talk to Black Lives Matter? How do you talk to Occupy Wall Street when they're leaderless and so on? And Milo's right, it's not hard to do, it just takes work. But what seems to be the stumbling block for a lot of the mainstream media and a lot of the people who are present on the panel and elsewhere is that it's hard to shift your perception and your perspective excuse me, into the online paradigm. It's a new paradigm for them. They don't understand it. They have their slot, they have their ways of doing things that they understand, and it's very hard for them to move across. And these people aren't old, really. I'm nearly 40. I grew up on BBSs and so on, and I understand the modern internet and how it works. Some of these guys are younger than me, and yet their understanding of the internet is that of a 70-year-old, and this is not good. As a reporter, you're part of the information economy, and always were. So if you don't understand the internet properly, that's a major failing on your part as a reporter. We, frankly, I think, need some kind of training course for any and all modern reporters, so that they can understand and report on the internet effectively. Was it Brad Glasgow? He's the guy who did the interview on Reddit. He tried out an experiment. He actually tried. He went and he tried to talk to people, and while it was a long-winded approach to doing it, I think it was a good example of an approach. A simpler one would be what Cathy Young did. You ask, you observe, you look for the people who are at least temporarily, the sort of spokespeople of the movement, not by virtue of being elected or forcing their way in, but just this is the thing about Gamergate, it shifts and moves organically, and it's the same with other movements. I mean, in Black Lives Matter, DeRay has had a lot of pushback even from within the black community, so someone else will probably pop up in relation to Ferguson and Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it, and will become the new locus of attention. And all you need to do really is observe. So if we're talking about Gamergate as a hashtag, what you would do is you would start the hashtag and maybe a couple of the other ones associated with it. It's like Not Your Shield and SPJAirplay now, and you would watch, and you would see who gets retweeted a lot, who's involved a lot, who gets quoted, talked about a lot, and from that you can pluck out who at least is wired in and informed, because Gamergate is really, if you look at the data studies that were made, it's a bunch of different clusters of people who all talk with each other, and occasionally that goes between group to group. So if you can identify who or a group of people that are at the centre of each cluster, then you can start plucking away and finding a few people to talk to. Oliver would be a good example. Sargon would be a good example. Back in the old days, Internet Aristocrat would have been a good guy to talk to. And that just shows how it's changed, because he's out, other people are in, other people are being talked about. Game Diviner would be a good person to talk to at the moment. Grums would be a good person to talk to, and so it goes. But that's constantly changing. So you have to kind of test the waters each time and find who to talk to. It's not that hard. Maybe it's inconvenient. Maybe it's work, too much work, because there's not an immediately obvious person to talk to. But as a reporter, you have a commitment to find what's true. So you have to put the work in. It's just not good enough to be lazy and I can't be bothered talking to that side of the argument because it's too difficult. I'm just going to take everything this person says as gospel. That just doesn't work like that. To us, certainly, the methods to find people should be obvious, but it seems like it apparently isn't, and it's very hard for people who are so plugged in to understand why people who aren't have such a hard time figuring it out. People who aren't wired into social media or the rest of it. If you're going to report on this stuff, even if you're a writer without portfolio, you even more so then you have to put the work in. Ren snarkily said, these people are leaders, and that's not really true. They're just temporary spokesmen. It's not like they're elected or selected. It's just that there's a kind of shifting group consensus that this is a good person for the moment. It got worse as you went on. Koretsky and Milo started really kind of going at each other. I don't feel that Milo started out that way, but Koretsky's constant needling and interruptions of everybody, and yes, Milo was interrupting people as well, but that just made it into a much more hostile and loggerheaded panel. When one was talking about his work, he was talking about some of it is opinion, some of it is news, some of it's a mix. I guess the issue Gamergate has is that the opinion parts of what other people have written has been transplanted across and used without actually being news, whereas actual proper news about Gamergate hasn't been moved around. So yeah, that's another problem. I don't think Gamergate wants media attention per se, but it wants media correction. It wants media to do better and to report on these things accurately. So it's not necessarily that Gamergate wants to be under the spotlight. They just, if you're reporting on things that concern it, it wants it to be done right. There was a problem with something Lynn said after that. She said you shouldn't kind of attack people, but if it's the media that's at fault, how do you address the problems with the media without attacking it or being perceived as attacking it? Is media immune to criticism simply because it has the loud hailer? I don't think so. I mean, there's got to be some kind of guard or watch or process that allows for the media to be criticised effectively without it losing its shit. And that was part of the problem that Gamergate had, in that it became obvious that these problems existed in the games media. The games media circled the wagons to protect itself from criticism, and then was uncritically repeated by the mainstream media, despite being the target of what's at fault, and nobody bothered to talk to Gamergate about what are these issues. Now that we've been able to articulate the issues to a group that is concerned with professional ethics, they've agreed that these are problems, so vindicated. But when is that going to be reported? When are these issues going to be reported? And now Gamergate has spawned its own issues with the media, including the mainstream media. Why aren't you reporting on this properly? Why aren't you getting both sides? Why aren't you talking to people? Alright, we know it's difficult, but that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to present both sides of the argument, and they haven't. As much as Lynn might be idealistic about this, they simply haven't done it. I know, as much as it might break her heart, but if it's the goal of the SPJ to spread these ideas that groups should be ethical, and these sometimes quite major, sometimes national media organisations are not doing this, then there's a problem, and the SPJ doing what it's doing clearly isn't working. So that's another problem to take away from this. Again, the problem kept coming up. Koretsky kept trying to ignore the past, but then if you ignore the past, how do you learn from it? How do you illustrate the problem? And then suggest solutions. So, here's what happened, these are the problems, here's how we can fix them. That seems like a natural flow of conversation to me. Because if you're just presenting the solutions, no one's going to understand why you need the solutions or what they relate to. So, yeah, that's a problem. Beats were brought up in that people like Eric Kane have a tech beat or a culture beat, or whatever that they were. But Gamergate doesn't fit neatly into any of these categories. Is it an entertainment story? Is it a technology story? Is it a women's issues story, if you take the false narrative? Is it a business story? And if we've got journalists reporting on journalists, is it a journalism story? Yes, all of these, none of these, some of them, combinations. It doesn't fit neatly into a beat, and that's an issue. And maybe sites need not just a tech reporter, but an internet reporter. Because during all this, tech reporters, games reporters, they've gotten it wrong as well. Well, generously, let's say they got it wrong rather than they deliberately distorted things, which I think was probably the case in some instances. But this is a problem that kept coming up. The media does not, or the mainstream media does not understand the internet. It doesn't understand the cultures, it doesn't understand the slang, it doesn't understand what trolls are, it doesn't understand what shitposting is, it doesn't know how to use Twitter, it doesn't know how to use Facebook, it doesn't know how to use any of this. It doesn't understand people who've grown up on the internet, it doesn't understand people who've spent the majority of their lives on the internet in one way or another. Media just doesn't understand how to approach it, and that's and that's made utterly obvious in the way that they have taken the trolls and the doxers and everything else as being Gamergate, rather than understanding that they're a sideline and irrelevance. Really, it's not. There's a separate story, definitely, about harassment and doxing and threats and stuff on the internet. It's a separate story, though. It's not Gamergate. If you're going to report on Gamergate, report on Gamergate. If you want to report on harassment, report on harassment. And I think most of us can agree that these kind of things, bomb threats, death threats, doxing, sending shit through the mail and so on, I think most of us on all sides can agree that this is bad, but it's not the discussion that Gamergate is having. It's a separate discussion. But the discussion about Gamergate keeps getting hijacked by this other set of stories. And plus that story as well, is another issue, is being misrepresented as a women's issue when it's not. It's an everybody issue. But that's a whole other ball of wax. I think it was unfair to ask Kathy if she'd done the work on both sides, because like she said, what we've been presented with by mainstream media and the games media has been so utterly one-sided that she was trying to redress the balance. So it's a bit unfair to get at her for that. And it's all very well the SPJ people there on the panel saying, well, this is what I would do, I would get both sides. But that's not what's happened in relation to Gamergate. Almost nobody has tried to talk to Gamergate or get their side of the debate. A few have. A few smaller radio shows and things on the BBC may have talked to a couple of people, but the big main reports that everyone sees, there's been no attempt to get both sides of the debate at all, and sometimes it hasn't even been represented even in weasel word terms. You know, Gamergate claims to be about ethics and journalism, and it's only after SPJ did a Polygon article come out that actually sort of couched both sides in reserved terms. So it said Gamergate says it's about this, blah 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 blah, and their opposition says it's about this, blah 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 blah. But it didn't say Gamergate is this, which was a huge step forward for us, but was immediately leapt on by certain people as being somehow giving in to Gamergate or being disappointing simply because it wasn't prosecuting their narrative to the same strong level anymore. Still wasn't a particularly great article, but I want to celebrate that it was a step forward. So for all Lynn's pretty words, unfortunately this isn't what's happened, and it might be a basic thing to her that this is what should happen, but it's not what really anybody has done. Anonymity was an important issue that came up. Now, anonymity on the internet is really important to a lot of people, and I mean total anonymity. You know, when you've got doxing, things being sent to your house, you know, dead animals, razor blades, syringes, you know, years of supplies of toilet paper, pizzas, shit like that. You know, you want to keep yourself anonymous, and there's a lot of paranoia amongst a lot of people, and frankly it's justified. And people do not trust media, not just games media, mainstream media. When you've got this completely one-sided narrative, you know, people are afraid that speaking up will ruin their careers or get them chased out of their home or get them swatted and doxed. You know, might get their dog shot by the police if you live in the States. You know, these are real worries, and the Game Diviner stood up and said this was a problem with Gorka, but it's also a problem with talking to the media. Now, privately revealing yourself to a writer or to their editor can be okay, but there's no basis of trust there with anybody. Why would we trust a media that's been completely one-sided and not even tried to talk to us? If they came to us now and said, okay, we want to talk to you, but you know, we can do it with you being presented anonymously, but you've got to give me your bona fides and you've got to give my editor your bona fides. Why would we trust you now? I mean, it's okay for me and it's okay for a few others who maybe don't have families or whose career isn't contingent on this, but our voices probably aren't the most important. I mean, Derek's would be. The people Derek mentioned that there are other big developers and so on that he talks to that sympathise with Gamergate but can't possibly mention it because the media would screw them over. We need people like that to feel free and able to come forward, and we need other ways of affirming who they are. The trouble is, if you give away enough information to confirm to reporters and their editors, or even to Reddit mods for AMAs, who you are and that you are really who you say you are, or that you have the necessary information. That can often be enough information for trolls and harassers to find out who you are as well, and then you're in trouble. So it's hard. A lot of us who are open don't have the clout to be newsworthy, perhaps. Some of us could maybe volunteer to talk to news media. I'm kind of hoping there's going to be some reporters at Gamergate in Birmingham to talk to. That would be useful. But a lot of other people can't or don't want to. They don't want that level of harassment and scrutiny. And despite Gamergate being pegged as a harassment group, it isn't, and people within it have been harassed. So, this fear has a basis. There would need to be a lot of reassurance, maybe legal contracts that, if we reveal your name, then I don't know, we have to pay you a sum in compensation, something like that. Something extra to reinforce that level of trust that simply doesn't exist at the moment. Because if you give enough information to convince the reporter's got to still convey enough information to convince their audience that you're a useful and relevant source, and that can be enough for you to be found out. So, yeah, it's trouble. And this lack of trust, it's not down to a few bad apples in games journalism. It's endemic. Virtually every mainstream news organisation has made the same mistakes, misrepresented Gamergate in exactly the same way, made the same lazy cut and paste arguments, had the same talking heads on with nobody to oppose them, no opposition point of view. So that's why nobody trusts them. Email interviews, that was an interesting point that came up. Things like Black Lives Matter are much more confined to the US continent, so it's less of an issue there, but when you've got an international movement like Gamergate, time zones become an issue. People are busy. Again, there's the requirement for anonymity. So email interviews may be less than ideal, but they're often the best of the available options because you're in different time zones. Asynchronous communication is possible via email. You take your time. You can pick your words. So when people are busy and international and time zones are an issue, then email may still end up being the best way. There are some messengers that allow short video messages to be sent back and forth. Maybe that's a possible compromise, something like, I don't know, Kick, perhaps, which allows for that sort of thing. Then the police arrived and bomb threat went off, and that was as far as anyone got. Excuse me. I understand there were more conversations outside, but I haven't really been able to watch any of those in a state where I could hear what was being said or going on. So the afternoon, much more disappointing, but I'm still taking away from it that there are things that can be done, things that need to be done to educate mainstream media on how to report on the internet. Maybe there's materials we can provide, training we could offer, that sort of thing. Maybe via the SPJ we can offer tools and resources that would help in that way. It's something I'd like to get the League for Gamers academic group onto, and I did a video myself on sort of how to report on the internet. I'd like to do something like that in more depth later on. So that's something to think about anyway. But yeah, despite the disappointment of the afternoon session, we can still take away that a lot of what's gone on, professional journalists also disagree with. Everyone hates Gawker, and that the ethical issues that Gamergate has been bringing up since the dawn of time are real and genuine, and it's not just our imagination that these are bad. They are genuine problems. So all in all, I think bomb threats and stupidity aside, and the disappointment of the second panel aside, I think Airplay was very much worth it and has vindicated Gamergate and made a lot of it worthwhile. The question then is, where do we move on from here? How can we keep this positivity moving forward? So that will be an interesting thing to discuss.